what we're talking about today, one of my areas of interest is pragmatics. And pragmatics I see as the intersection between language and culture. And we all, are familiar with grammar and vocabulary, but pragmatics is this part about language that's complicated when we're learning a second language because it's the cultural piece and things that when we grow up in a language we learn just by being, by living in a family, by living in a particular community context. But when you learn a second language, sometimes there are cultural references or ways of saying or doing things that don't quite make sense or that are difficult to learn. And I was giving an example recently, even within the same variety of language. So I imagine some things are done in Spanish differently here than they are in Venezuela, let's say, or in Spain, right? For me, I had this experience when I went to England last summer and I was visiting friends, and we ran into a friend on the street, and his greeting to me was, I'm not going to remember it. Are you all right? And my response as a native speaker of North American English was, am I all right? Why? Is there something wrong with me? Do I have something on my face? Do I look like I'm sick? But that's just the common conventional greeting. As we're used to saying in North America, how are you? How are things? What's up? Those kinds of things. So the greeting in Britain is, you all right? Then I had to figure out what the answer is. Is the answer, I'm fine, thanks, how are you? Like I would normally say. Turns out the answer is, fine, yeah, thanks, and you? Right, so it's similar kind of thing, but slight differences that we're not used to. And this all falls under the larger category of pragmatics. I thought it would be useful to begin with a definition of pragmatics that I like. This is by the applied linguist George Yule, and he describes pragmatics as the study of speaker meaning, the study of invisible meaning, how we understand what's meant even when it isn't actually said. How can that be? How can we mean things without saying them? Can you think of any examples from your own experience? How we understand when somebody means something even though it's not at the level of the words that they use.
Gestures.
Yeah, exactly. Intonation, right? So another linguist I'm familiar with gives the example of that greeting, how are you? So, you see somebody on the street, one of my Thai students was joking and said, oh, North Americans are so superficial because they say, how are you? And they keep walking before you can answer the question, right? But we can also use that same construction, the same exact words, if somebody that we know has been ill and we want to find out more information about how they're doing. How are you? Right? With a different expression, different intonation, the same words take on a different meaning. So this is sort of what we mean about the invisible meaning, what's meant behind the literal level of what's said. And so under this category, usually we talk about speech acts, things like greetings. Can you think of any other speech acts that you're, like social functions of language? Apologies. Invitations. There's some other. Promises, yeah. Any other ones? Requesting is super important because if we want to get things done, we have to ask somebody to do it, right? That can be difficult or easy depending on what our relationship is. Threatening, if the request doesn't get met, and other culturally variable ways of expressing intention. And we'll talk about some examples and show some examples in a minute. Okay, sorry. Before I go here, I wanted to set up this video. So as I mentioned, sometimes it's difficult when you travel and visit another country, even if you've studied the language, let's say for 5 or 10 years, you know the textbook, cover to cover, but then you find that there are some ways of doing things linguistically that somehow you haven't been prepared for. And it's not anything malicious on the part of the textbook designer probably, but these are cultural differences, right? A couple more words about pragmatics. So it has to do with meaning in context. So just like that how are you example, those same 3 words, same question essentially, can mean different things depending on the situation that we're in. That has to do with location and physical space. Are we in a formal context or an informal? Are we at home? Are we at work? Are we in some other professional setting? It has to do with the type of speech activity. Is it a job interview? Is it a classroom discussion? Is it a formal meeting of some sort? The second point about pragmatics is that it's language. I like to tell my students it's language plus. So it's the linguistic elements, but there are also non-linguistic and paralinguistic things that go along with that, as we've already said. So those include nonverbal expressions, things like gaze, are you making eye contact, intonation, how you deliver the utterance, turn taking, do you wait until the person's finished speaking, or do you just jump in and start talking, right? And those are things that are highly variable according to culture, and they're also relative. Things like pausing, silence, how comfortable is a speaker with a certain amount of silence? Do you need to keep talking to fill this space? And then, as I mentioned earlier, pragmatics is really the language-culture interface. So having to do with rituals and conventions, things like how do we greet one another, how do we say goodbye. I was just talking with a teacher this morning who said that she was an exchange student in the US for a while, and she was very disturbed that at the end of the day when people were getting ready to leave, they would just say, yeah, see you later, and walk out the door. And she said, no, I need a hug or a kiss or some kind of, please give me a signal so that I know that this interaction is ending, right? And so the amount of time that you take to perform those rituals varies as well. Interpretive frames, how we understand things in a given context, and that has to do with the very final point. That relies a lot on our shared background and our shared experiences. So things that we do without even realizing, being consciously aware. Someone might even ask you a question of how do you do leave taking? And gosh, I've never thought about that. I don't know if I do that in Spanish, or do we do that? Yeah. So a lot of it is below the level of consciousness, which makes it difficult to teach, difficult to observe, and difficult for learners to understand. We need to use all of the tools that we have at our disposal, and so that's where I think popular culture texts can come in handy. Many of you are probably very familiar with this metaphor. Culture is like an iceberg, right? And so the very top layer is just 1%, and those are the things that are perceptible auditorily, through our senses, things that we can observe, things like food and national costume and dress and games and celebrations and dances. Those are the easy parts of culture, I would argue, to teach, because you can show images, we can understand that through discussion and through illustration. What's much more difficult, I think, to first understand and then be able to teach are those things that are beneath the surface, which is all of that cultural information. And I'm sorry that the text is so small here, but the things that I've highlighted in red have to do with pragmatics. So things like courtesy, right? Politeness. How do we show that we're being polite? Conversational patterns, facial expressions. Different ways of showing that you're happy, that's culturally variable. Nonverbal communication, body language, things like laughing, for example. In certain cultures, it's a sign of embarrassment, right? Whereas in certain other cultures, it's a sign of appreciation, or that you're enjoying yourself and having a good time. So the same behavior can have different meanings in different cultural contexts. Things like eye contact and tone of voice, intonation. So all of this stuff that's below the surface, a lot of this contributes to pragmatic meaning. And it's not only about language, but it's about all of these other things as well.